Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our March Idea Lecture Series here at UNC. I'm Ashley Apiaje. I'm a third-year resident here at UNC, helping to help host and moderate this session today. Today is actually a really new and exciting time because we have a guest moderator for the first time in our Idea Lecture Series, Dr. Andrea Knittel. I am going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Knittel, and then she is going to introduce our wonderful speaker today. So Dr. Knittel is an assistant professor in general OBGYN here at the University of North Carolina. She completed her medical training and PhD at the University of Michigan, and then residency training at the University of California in San Francisco. And then we were lucky enough to steal her to come join us here in North Carolina. She serves as the medical director for Incarcerated Women's Health. She is a researcher and a clinician and an amazing teacher who is very passionate about taking care of the women of North Carolina and beyond, but particularly women in the prison system here in the United States. So we are very fortunate to have her here to help introduce our guest speaker. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Knittel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. So we are incredibly privileged to have Christen Marquez here to chat with us. I think most of us at this point have had a chance to watch her amazing film, The Belly of the Beast. She is a producer and videographer who's committed to producing character-driven stories and covering social justice issues throughout the world. In 2012, she produced a narrative feature entitled Two Shadows, which was a fictionalized story about Cambodian families torn apart by the violent Khmer Rouge. And in the same year, she also completed her documentary feature debut, E Haku Noa, To Weave a Name, which follows a young multiracial Native Hawaiian throughout her journey to understand the meaning of her incredibly long Hawaiian name and reconnect with her estranged mother. Christen has also worked as a producer, videographer, and story producer for multiple short and feature-length docuseries for networks like PBS, National Geographic, Discovery, and Univision. Her work has been supported by Cal Humanities, the Independent Television Service, and Pacific Islanders in Communications. She has been honored with the Through the Soul of an Artist grant for artistic innovation by the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation and was selected for participation in the 2013 CPP PBS Producers Academy. Her film is beautiful and wonderful, and we're just so excited to have her here today. I, as the guest moderator, am going to take a tiny bit of privilege and go ahead and ask the first question, and then we can open it up for others to ask, unless Christen, you wanted to talk for a little bit before I start asking questions.
No, I think we can launch right into your questions.
Perfect. So as many of you know from the introduction at the very least, I spend a lot of time thinking about caring for incarcerated people. And in the video, I think there is a particularly, I would say, unflattering, but rightfully so, picture of ACOG as really not making the right decision in terms of advocacy around the bill that was happening in California that ultimately ended up prohibiting sterilization of women who are incarcerated. My sense, and I was sharing this a little bit with Christen before we started, is that as a field, we sort of failed to see the trees for the forest in our enthusiasm to advocate for full spectrum reproductive health services for everyone. We seem to have sort of missed that there may be some women in some situations who cannot consent no matter how many opportunities we give them. And Christen, I would love to hear sort of your take and kind of the decision that you made in terms of artistically about what to include relating to OBGYN physicians, as many of us in the audience are, and how we might take that and move forward.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a great setup. Oh, I did forget to say there's one thing that I wanted to mention. I'm joining you here from the ancestral land of the Tongva people, which is otherwise known as Los Angeles. But so I think that ACOG scene, especially for people in your profession, I think really sticks out. And I think one thing that, and rightfully so, because I think it really highlights the kind of the intersection between and the rub between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, right? So I'm not sure how many people in this audience might be are familiar with those two kind of parallel tracks, but reproductive rights obviously is fighting for access to things like birth control and to be able to make choices for your body, for yourself. And then reproductive justice is kind of another, movement that said, hey, there's pieces here that are not being addressed by the reproductive rights movement, and these two movements obviously fall, well, maybe not so obviously, but do fall along very much so like racial lines. So a lot of the time, there are communities they just don't have the same access issues or the same privilege to be able to access, well, I mean, in the context of the film, right? Incarcerated women, this is an inherently coercive environment. And as much as, we would love to provide, reproductive health and reproductive, the ability to get hysterectomies or, these types of things, abortions, whatever people might need inside. The unfortunate fact is the overall structure of being incarcerated. It's not a environment in which you're able to give consent because you're threatened. Your entire existence is threatened through violence, and in a lot of ways, the systems of incarceration are already, and we can get into eugenics because obviously that's like a huge part of the film, but just highlighting the way that these eugenic systems take away the right to family, which is as much a right as the right to choose, right? But it takes away the right to a family for women of color, people of color who are incarcerated in women's prisons. So I think, yeah, that scene is really important in terms of like bringing up that idea of like, oh, reproductive justice versus reproductive rights and how those things play out in the context of the prison system.
Thanks so much. I could keep asking more questions probably all day.
And
go ahead, Ashley.
Folks on the Zoom, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We can also take questions that way and ask them as we go along. I think that one of the really striking scenes for me and other people I know who've watched the film is the reaction when they cover the social media reaction to the story initially being highlighted in the media, and the surprisingly prevalent feeling that there was nothing wrong with women being involuntarily sterilized. Have you found that since this film has come out, what has been the general reception? Of course, there are going to be many people like those of us who are in this call who are appalled and are obviously feel like it's a no-brainer that is something that is atrocious and that we should be really fighting against. But there are many people out there who feel otherwise. And I'm curious that if once the film came out, if you guys got a lot of feedback from the other side.
I think at least from where I stand, I know we have, I think overwhelmingly, and this can be the type of outreach and the type of coalition building and that the film has done in terms of getting it out there. We know who are our our people are, right? And we really don't have time for those who are not our people with this. I mean, as much as possible, the film is trying to win over hearts and minds, I suppose. But we know, and this was always a consideration throughout the production of the film, we know that there are people who think, oh, well, that's a person who's done something wrong. And, you know, if you don't want X to happen to you, don't go to jail, you know? And so there's a tolerance, you know, there was a segment of the population that we knew are going to be the people that we're most likely not going to be able to reach, at least maybe at this time in their life. You know, hopefully they continue to get educated and just can come to the place where people begin to see the humanity of people who are incarcerated, rather than seeing them as people who deserve whatever happens to them in that space. So, I mean, I guess the short answer is, yeah, there's definitely, we have been able to pull quotes and, you know, we plan on using those in certain ways as well. But, you know, overwhelmingly, I think we know who we're speaking to, we know who we're trying to convince and who we're trying to educate. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive and supportive and lifting up, so.
Thanks so much. There's a question in the chat from Dr. Morse, just asking to hear a little bit more about that question of consent, and highlighting that as clinicians, we like to think that our patients can make their own autonomous decisions. And I think implying that it sometimes is hard for us to wrap our heads around circumstances where people really don't have any autonomy. And in the making of the film, did any of the women talk to you about that experience, or are there conversations that maybe weren't included in the film but that you could share with us today?
Well, so Erica's position within the film initially, when I met her and she was working in on the film alone, she had started out as a legal advocate. So she was actually going and doing legal advocacy work with women inside, and so there are a lot of conversations that did not make it into the film. So as far as, so you're saying, I guess the question is, what was that experience like as far as like the moment when maybe you're being asked for consent, and how that experience is? I mean, I definitely know a lot about Kelly's experience with that. I mean, it's just, a lot of it is very rushed, right? It's like, hurry up. You know, there's a batch of people who are in line to get whatever kind of procedure, and you know, the consent forms are like handed out like playing cards, and it's just like, hurry up, hurry up. You know, there's not really a time to sign them or to read it. And even a lot of the, you know, and I did hear all of the audio conversations. I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily have they don't have the background knowledge of their own body to even maybe understand what they're reading, even if they have the time to read it. And then, you know, I think, and I don't know how much I can necessarily, I feel like I can't necessarily go into as much of the feeling of what it's like, because I have never been in that position. I've never been a person who's incarcerated. So I don't necessarily want to speak on anyone's behalf, but, you know, I think just all you can really say is that your life when you're incarcerated is always under the power of someone else. And you just, you know, and it's, you know, threat of violence, threat of withholding, you know, threat of withholding future medical care that you may need. It's a pressure that I could not imagine. So if that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks so much. If it's okay, I'm Jess, and I'm the one who asked that question. I think that's really helpful for us. I think as clinicians, we really do try and imagine that we're trying to provide information and like help people make autonomous decisions. And so I think just painting that picture of what it's like, and I think what you just described in that image in the movie where it was like going down the row of women's knees and you didn't even see their faces, but just really painting that picture, because it is hard to wrap your mind around that idea that right, if you haven't been incarcerated, we don't have that sense that we really don't have the capacity to make a decision free of coercion. And I wonder sometimes how different that line is probably not only drawn for incarcerated people, and that ability is probably a little murkier than we imagine for people who are on the outside. But that certainly on the inside, I think your film helps us really see that kind of those granular things that most of us have no concept about, of like why autonomy just doesn't exist. And I think it's really antithetical to our training. And so I'm like, was asking because I really want to hear the detail that you're providing, because it helps me understand like why it's not possible.
And, I certainly, in terms of full disclosure, we do provide sterilizations for women who want them, who are incarcerated in North Carolina. And I struggle with this a little bit myself, because we generally will only provide sterilization after we've had sort of an ongoing relationship through a woman's pregnancy. We don't ever suggest it. And so it's really just for women who themselves say, I wanted this after my last pregnancy and I couldn't get it, often because of arcane Medicaid restrictions in our state. And so I guess I am interested in your perspective as to whether you think there's ever a time when folks can consent, because I think from sort of my perspective, it's incredibly hard to say no to someone who comes to me and says, what I want is to end my pregnancy. And we might spend an hour exploring, you want to end your pregnancy because you think something's going to change about your incarceration, and like, is there, how can we talk about this? Or you want sterilization because you think that someone else wants you to be sterilized, or and sort of exploring that. And I would be interested in terms of your take as to whether it is possible to obtain consent with enough time and context.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very complicated and that is one of the questions, right? I think definitely, as far as the perspective of the film and the perspective, I think in California, we've seen countless abuses. We've seen any sliver of ability and consent within the context of incarceration to just be abused. So I think at least the stance of the film is we should err on the side of caring for people's right to family, just because of the coercive nature of incarceration. But as you're explaining it, of course, and as you and I were speaking, before the group joined us, there's no one size fits all. That's kind of the difficult part of this, right? Because yes, of course, we still believe in a woman's right to choose, but I think, or I always believe in the woman's right to choose. But again, just what we've seen in those contexts, we want to be able to protect people's right to family.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm just going to make one small comment and then I'll go to the questions from the chat. But I do think it's so interesting to see a film made in a state where the sort of default is the right to choose. And so the right to family becomes this real discussion, being watched in a state where the right to family is sort of the default and I think in many circumstances forced on people. And it is that difference, I think, frames things, you know, as you said, that there's sort of no one answer. And certainly I will transition now to the comments in the chat. I agree with Adam, who posted that it was incredibly moving and a call to action, and described the movement for reparations in California as just the beginning. And his question is, in the making of the film, did you learn more about the scope of sterilization of incarcerated people across the country? In other words, where else is this sort of human rights abuse proceeding unchecked?
We did initially, I joined the film actually because I was in North Carolina working on another project, and Erica contacted me because we were interested in the reparations bill that was passing, I forget now, I guess maybe it was 6 or 7 years ago, in North Carolina for the historic eugenics programs that were in North Carolina. So that was something that I had been researching a lot. And actually North Carolina, we often point to as kind of a, I guess, a leader in the reparations movement. Not in the program, but in terms of the reparations that have come from it. You know, and we've been pointing to, you know, a lot of like, look, this is possible reparations for these historic and the current abuses that are happening to people incarcerated. You know, these are things that are absolutely, at least in some way, are able to be made as right as they can be. Let me see, sorry, I need to revisit the question to make sure I'm, yes, so in other words, we are sure. The thing is, California is the place where the abuses were, and this is definitely not to say we were not able to get as much documentation as we would have liked, and that we know, like the way that we found out about these abuses primarily was through Cynthia and her work and speaking with people inside. We know we were also looking very much into Tennessee. And at one point, again, when I first kind of joined the film, we were like, are we going to look into other places where this is happening? But honestly, in terms of getting information about people's medical records inside, you know, people inside are not even able to get their own medical records. So we are very sure that this is happening in other places. The problem is that people who it's happening to may not know, and it's extremely hard to find evidence. Although I will also mention that I think it was in September, there was a whistleblower named Don Wooten who, you know, was talking about hysterectomies that were being performed on people in ICE detention. So, I mean, I think just that as an example of like, this is continuing and this will continue until more and more people become aware and outraged by it.
Absolutely. And this is certainly, you know, North Carolina was both a leader in eugenics and now, thankfully, a leader in fixing some of those things. But it certainly was not alone. And I think, you know, internationally, there have been just massive numbers of women sterilized without their consent. There, at this point, are some ongoing investigations in Peru actually looking at a state family planning program that was, you know, in the 90s. So not,
yeah.
I think we think of these things as like, oh, they happened so many years ago, but they're really very recent.
Yeah. Oh, and then just one thing to add to that as well, just a concept to bring out, which I mean, it's in the film, but the idea that just incarceration and incarcerating people through their childbearing years, you know, 80% of women, something like that, and people inside are incarcerated through the ages of 18 and 44. So it's by locking people up during those times, you're essentially, you know, preventing them from starting a family. So the idea that incarceration is a eugenic practice, like mass incarceration is a eugenic practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some other questions from the chat. First, as you walked through the conversations you had with women interviewed, did the women share insights or offer advice for how we could promote an autonomy promoting environment within an incarcerated setting? I think maybe just following up, that's from Dr. Connolly, on some ways that we might be able to offer our patients here additional autonomy when they are referred to us for various procedures or consultation.
I think to go back to the idea of, there's not a one size fits all. I would say that as far as my biggest piece of advice would be to involve incarcerated people in deciding what those processes should look like, as much as possible. And I think even then, it might be hard to talk to currently incarcerated people about that type of thing in a way that's not potentially compromised. I think working with some kind of coalition between current and formerly incarcerated people, you probably get closer to something like that. And then I know that something that we've talked about, is there a way, and I know that this isn't, it's like, is there a thing that makes sense, like once you are re-entering the free world, is there a time where a certain, those ideas of whatever sterilization types of procedures, that is the time that's most appropriate to offer and provide those types of services? Yeah, because I guess ultimately it's, if you're making a decision that's going to permanently impact your capacity to have a family, is that a decision that should be made while incarcerated? And I think, again, the position of the film and our position is that no, that those types of permanent decisions, life-altering decisions, should not and cannot be made inside.
Yeah, I think that is an important reminder for all of us as we're counseling patients to think about whether there are non-permanent alternatives to what a patient might be asking for. In particular, I'm thinking about a patient who had extremely large fibroids and said, if you have to do a hysterectomy, that's fine. And I said, under no circumstances will we be doing a hysterectomy. Like we can take out your fibroids and we can fix your problem, but we don't need to sterilize you. Like that's not part of what we need to do. And I think there are often alternatives to sterilizing procedures that are available. And I would also encourage all of us, and then, like I said, I keep saying I'm going to step down off the soapbox. I'm just so excited about this. But I would also encourage all of us, as we're very enthusiastic about long-acting reversible contraception. Those of us who see patients in the prison see those long-acting sort of reversible contraceptive devices getting left in for a long time, and people being unable to have them removed, such that they're functionally a sterilizing intervention, even if that was not the plan of, certainly wasn't the plan of the patient. And I will give the provider the benefit of the doubt that that was not their intention either. And so certainly as we counsel people, thinking about, what does it look like when you go home, and can you get your IUD or your implant taken out at the time that you want, and when might be the right time to think about sterilization, to Christen's point. Next question from the chat. How did you decide to focus on Kelly as the narrator of the film? Was there any hesitation on her part to share her story? She mentioned at the end of the film that she was waiting for her happy ending. Did she express finding happiness in this advocacy work?
I love the way that question is framed. Yes, she does find happiness in her advocacy work. And I wanted to shout out her, her kind of what she's been doing since. She started her own nonprofit called Back to the Basics, doing community work and improving, the neighborhood that she grew up in. And she's also a LA County Commissioner now as well. So she's definitely keeping herself busy and, just doing everything, and just living the inspirational, beautiful life that, that her spirit is always going to, I think, follow when other things are not standing in her way. So focus on Kelly is, I think once she started testifying, it was very hard for her, and Erica and her, Kelly was initially an advisor on the film, and they had a very long relationship off camera before she came to be in front of the camera. But I feel like, especially in the early days of the film when we didn't have Kelly as participating in front of the camera, I was always like, but what if Kelly was in the film? And so, I think it took a long time to build the trust that, because her story had been used, and that she had not really felt empowered by that experience of sharing her story. I mean, even through the testifying, that it's taken a lot out of her, because it's a lot to relive traumatic things. So yes, there was hesitation. But I think ultimately she saw the relationship between her and Erica was, she felt like she could trust her to tell her story. And I think ultimately she's very happy with the telling of the story. And she said that this film is making art out of the most terrible thing that happened to her, the most terrible thing that could happen to someone. So I think that's really probably one of the best reviews that the film has gotten.
A related question from the chat, just if you could share a little bit about sort of how you navigated the process of sharing a story that was potentially re-traumatizing in the telling, to sort of how to both minimize, I guess, the pain and trauma of sharing that, while also sharing the most, sort of beautifully told version of the film.
Yeah, I think we took a lot of care to make sure that on days that there was kind of a marathon of interview. It's the interview where she's in the blue shirt. We always made sure, we had to make a lot of space for her, in terms of her, like, she really had she has recovery time for that. And we always made sure that we could be as gentle with her as possible, knowing that we would have to be talking about things that are harming her, so that was something that was always like built into the process of the film, if that answers that question. And I mean, continuing even now, we and it's a work in progress. Like, let's just say that, sometimes we would mess up, but she would, I think it's just acknowledging those times and improving and doing better, and that's one thing that why, when we talk about Kelly, we just want to make sure that we talk about the great things that she's doing now, just every single time, to let everybody know that she's, that is a point in her life, but she's moving on and will continue to do great things.
And just how incredible to be able to take something so awful and share it in a way that is just absolutely inspirational. So thank you for working with her on that. And thank you so much to her for her willingness to share. The next question from the chat, how, if at all, does Justice Now's work in California overlap with the movement for prison abolition? What stood out to Caroline was that the majority of women who are incarcerated have been victims of domestic violence, which seems to indicate that what they need isn't incarceration, but safe and supportive environments. Yes is my response. I'm interested to hear what you think.
Yes, yes. So Justice Now was absolutely an abolitionist organization. Yes, yes. So it absolutely, maybe not even overlap. I feel like they were one of, they're a very, especially at that time, they were one of the few, if not only, legal advocacy organizations that had board members who were currently incarcerated. So, just moving towards that, that's definitely, so yes, prison abolition, that's Justice Now absolutely just did that work. And yes, that is a major point that we're trying to make with the film. That I think the stat that I have is 80% of women inside have been victims or are survivors of she was defending herself, and that was a crime, that it was labeled a crime, and she was incarcerated for that. So we're talking about women surviving, and they're being incarcerated. And I think that's a connection as well, obviously, to that same old prison industrial complex. And we've locked up a lot of Black and brown men. And who else do we have to lock up? The women. And that is the fastest growing population of people inside is women, primarily women of color.
Yeah, and I think in North Carolina too, we're seeing incredible growth in rural women's incarceration, and that is across racial groups, with sort of really unfortunate patterns of law enforcement around substance use has really just brought tremendous numbers of both Black, white, and brown rural women into our state prison system and into the jails as well.
Yeah, thank you actually for saying that, because I had some experience working with law enforcement in the context of a television show in Ashe County. and yeah, the very much predominantly white. And I think it's, in terms of looking at the differences between California and other places in Carolina, yeah, I think so. Thank you for what you said, because it is a different situation in North Carolina. Yeah. And rural, and the socioeconomic piece of things is different in North Carolina.
Yeah, and frankly varies a lot by county even within North Carolina. I think in a related question from another person in the chat, says one of the women in the film mentioned that she was placed in an incarcerated setting as an individual versus a mother and child facility. Did you find that this was common practice to place pregnant women in harsher facilities? And do you think this has an impact on the number of women who were sterilized?
I don't know, at least the pieces of research that I remember. I don't know that I could say that women or people who were pregnant people were in harsher facilities necessarily.
I think North Carolina may actually also be unique in this arena.
this is this is a systemic issue. Even within California, it was not only he who was providing these services. There were multiple people encouraging these decisions, this method, these outcomes. So, and I think that's why we always want to bring up things that are happening, like Don Wooten, and these are eugenic systems, and the fact that eugenic practice comes out of that is it actually, we talk about, oh, these things are shocking, but this should not be shocking, because this is how it's set up. And there are good actors. I mean, you're talking about bad actors, right? It's like within the systems there are, and it's depressing, or sounds dark to say, but it's maybe if you flip it and say the people who are good actors who are working against the system are more rare than the bad actors. So I don't know, and maybe that's overstated, maybe it's not.
I don't think so. I'm very much inclined to agree that we as a society seem to have created a system whose unstated and sometimes even stated outcome is eugenic. And so I like to think that, I and my colleagues are providing sort of harm reduction services within that system. But certainly it doesn't change the system. And you can have a few people who are doing what I like to think is really good things, but if the system doesn't change, the outcomes are always going to be inequitable.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something there when you said, unstated versus stated. So what it is that it's more rare to actually hear that statement. But by the fact that we as filmmakers captured that, well, Corey Johnson once and us once, I think it kind of does reinforce that truth that undergirds the entire thing. It's just unstated most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other questions from attendees? I think I've hit on everything that showed up in the chat.
Sorry, I'm really slow at typing, which my fiance likes to remind me of often. But one of the most heartbreaking parts of the film to me was women sharing just the trust that they placed in their providers, and they trusted them to do the right thing. And I don't know, that just hit me hard, because I would like to think that patients trust me to do the right thing for them. And in a lot of these cases, obviously that trust was very misplaced. And I think that physicians historically have a very poor track record of holding ourselves accountable and making sure that physicians who do things that are not in the interest of patients are removed from our profession, and that we are able to restore trust between the medical community, and especially communities such as the Black community, who have every reason to be mistrustful. And I'm wondering if there's any forward motion that you have, that you know about, in addressing specifically the providers that were involved in these cases, and just in general in this country, in regards to sterilization that is forced and without consent.
Yeah, there have not been any actions against the providers here in California. That's a great question, and I think we would love to see more people being held accountable within these systems, because then this is how we fix these systems, right? So unfortunately, at least with the film and what we felt was more attainable, was not accountability for the physicians, but reparations for survivors. So that's that's a whole nother, and I honestly think all the people on this call are probably better positioned to think about ways that would be effective in holding people accountable for this kind of abuse.
Yeah, it certainly, I think it should be disturbing to all of us that the sorts of practices that are described in the film were not met with sort of swift and punitive, frankly, action on the part of the California Medical Board and other governing bodies. I think that fact, combined with the sort of ACOG's real enthusiasm for providing sterilization to everyone, just at the end of the film, I was just sort of deflated. And I'm actually not sure, I don't know if anybody on the call is part of our North Carolina OBGYN society, perhaps in a more active leadership role than I, but I think it would be a reasonable step for us to all think about advocating within that group that, and also within ACOG, that we don't support these kinds of actions. And I think that there is, at least from my perspective, a way to do that that reflects that, you know, as I said, I continue to believe that there are circumstances in which women can provide consent, but that those, it can be only be sort of obtained in the most careful and frankly long lasting relationship with a patient. And so and Dr. Morse has shared that there that we could suggest a viewing of the film at the OBGYN Society annual meeting in 2 weeks, which is a fantastic idea. And I think we may even know the person who's responsible for the programming at said meeting. And so we'll see if we can get that done, so that at least in our state we can make a pretty decisive statement that this is not something that we would tolerate within our field.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Oh my gosh. That's very exciting.
And that brings together, that's our state's, hey, my name's Anna Marie Connolly, and I'm the vice chair for education for our department. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being so accessible to us. And so, gosh, just so open in this conversation today. This has been an extraordinary experience. The annual meeting of our ACOG section, North Carolina section, is, you know, a very well attended. Obviously, this year it'll be virtual. And it's really a time when everyone's focusing and centering on working as a state to promote women's health. And I really think that this is a time when people's minds are really centered on how can I be impactful? How can I be the best advocate I can be in my individual practice or in my individual setting? So this would be a really powerful opportunity and a powerful time for some shared mental modeling and some shared experience. So if there's a willingness to make this happen, wow, that could be really special.
That's very exciting.
Excellent. And I think that Celeste also just shared that the film is available to everyone on the call, and that she will send the link and the password to everybody, which is perfect, so that if you would like to watch it again, please do so. And so we've got just a couple of minutes left. If there's anybody who has sort of a burning question that is remaining, feel free to unmute yourself and share it now. And if not, Oh, Amy, perfect.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this film. It was really eye-opening, a new perspective for me. I just wanted to know what has been the most encouraging feedback that you've received after releasing this film.
Well, I'm just like, that's amazing if you guys would be able to make some kind of statement from ACOG. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So maybe that, I don't know. Feedback in terms of, I guess, because there's different kind of segments, you know, like I think from the from incarcerated people, you know, we've been getting a lot of, I mean, I guess maybe this isn't necessarily encouraging in a sense, but, you know, we've been getting Me Too's as well. So people who have suffered this type of abuse and, you know, either realizing what had happened to them or feeling that they could come forward for the first time and that maybe that their story has a place. So I think that that's something that's been really powerful. That's Kelly, you know, she goes a little bit back and forth, but, you know, we're talking about maybe doing some kind of convening of people who have, you know, are surviving from this, because really they're the most powerful and knowledgeable people to be able to help end these practices. So, you know, because very much with the film, you know, we believe that we can't move forward without them, but we also recognize that that they may not be ready yet. So that's kind of where we are with that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There are not enough thank yous in the world to convey how thrilled I am.
I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm gonna drop a few links in the chat. The first one is to the film's website, where we have some resources for more about reproductive justice and all types of resources, discussion guides, and etc. And then also at the top of the page, for those of you who may not have signed the petition for reparations for survivors of forced sterilization, I just put the direct link to the change.org petition there. So please, you know, sign it, share it, all of those things. And then lastly, in a fun and exciting way, the end credit song by Mary J. Blige is in contention for an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song. So that last one is the link to the song, the lyric video for the song. So again, if you can listen to it, you know, play it real loud in your car, send it to all your friends, and all of that. And it's an awesome song. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There are no words. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much.